Captain Lewis Nixon stood in Hermann Goering's wine cellar and tried to count the bottles. He stopped at 3,000, maybe 4. The numbers didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that every bottle represented something stolen. Every label told a story of occupation, and every case stacked floor to ceiling in this Bavarian mountain retreat belonged to the man who'd helped destroy Europe. It was May 5, 1945. The war in Europe had 3 days left. Nixon commanded nothing at this moment except his own astonishment. The cellar stretched deeper than he could see. Racks upon racks of Bordeaux, cases of champagne, cognac that predated the century, wine so valuable that a single bottle could feed a family for months. Behind him, paratroopers from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment were already making decisions: which bottles to drink first, which to send home. Whether the Chateau Lafite Rothschild from 1929 tasted different from the 1934. Nixon knew wine. His family owned Nixon Nitration Works in New Jersey. He'd grown up around wealth, but this wasn't wealth. This was plunder on an industrial scale. The bottles came from France, stolen systematically over 5 years, shipped north in convoys that could have carried ammunition or medical supplies. Instead, they carried the pride of French winemaking to German officers who wanted to toast their victories with the best vintages Europe had ever produced. Goering had assembled this collection personally. While French families starved under occupation, the Reichsmarschall was selecting Premier Cru Burgundies and discussing harvest years with his weinführers. While French resistance fighters died in cellars and camps, Goering was filling his cellar in Berchtesgaden with bottles worth more than most Germans would earn in a lifetime. Nixon picked up a bottle. Chateau Lafite Rothschild, 1937. The label was perfect, the fill level excellent. 8 years old, just reaching its prime. He held in his hand a piece of French heritage that Goering had seized as casually as he'd seized Poland. The irony wasn't lost on Nixon. The bottle came from a Jewish-owned chateau. The Rothschilds, their estate had been confiscated by the Vichy government. Their wines had been redistributed to Nazi leadership, and now this bottle, traveled hundreds of miles north, sat in a mountain fortress waiting for Goering to celebrate a 1,000-year Reich that had lasted 12. Down the hall, Major Dick Winters was organizing the distribution, 1 truckload per company. The officers would get first choice. The enlisted men would get the rest. By tomorrow, soldiers who'd survived Normandy and Bastogne would be drinking wines that had never been meant for them. How did it come to this? How did millions of bottles of France's finest wines end up in German hands? How did one of the greatest wine collections in history become the spoils of war? And what happened to the French winemakers who'd risked everything to keep their heritage from the Nazis? The answer begins not in Berchtesgaden, but in the vineyards of France. 5 years earlier, when German tanks rolled across the border and changed wine from a beverage into a weapon. June 1940, France fell in 6 weeks. The speed shocked everyone. France had fielded the largest army in Europe. Britain had sent an expeditionary force. Belgium and the Netherlands had mobilized. None of it mattered. German tanks bypassed the Maginot Line, cut through the Ardennes, and reached the Channel coast before French command could coordinate a response. On June 22, France signed an armistice. The northern half of the country would be occupied. The southern half would be administered by a collaborationist government based in Weich. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun, would lead this puppet state. The terms were humiliating but clear. France would pay for its own occupation. France would provide resources for the German war effort, and France would cooperate. Wine became a priority immediately. In the first weeks of occupation, German soldiers looted cellars with the enthusiasm of tourists who'd found an open bar. They walked into chateaus, demanded keys, and loaded trucks with whatever bottles they could carry. In Champagne, over 2 million bottles disappeared in less than a month. At La Tour d'Argent, the famous Parisian restaurant, soldiers emptied the wine cellar of tens of thousands of bottles. Some were drunk on the spot, others were shipped to Germany. The chaos offended German sensibilities. This wasn't organized, it wasn't efficient, and it wasted valuable resources that could be sold for foreign currency. Adolf Hitler called wine vulgar vinegar. He was a teetotaler, preferring mineral water or weak tea. But Hitler understood economics. French wine represented liquid gold. The finest labels commanded premium prices in neutral countries: Switzerland, Spain, South America, markets that would pay in hard currency that Germany desperately needed. In late summer 1940, the German Ministry of Economics created a new position, the Weinführer, wine leader. Each major wine region would get one. Their job was simple: buy as much French wine as possible, ship it to Germany, sell it internationally for massive profits. The money would fund the war machine. The Nazis chose their Weinführers carefully. They needed men who knew wine, who spoke French, who had business relationships in the industry, who could tell a grand cru from table wine. The German wine trade provided perfect candidates. For Bordeaux, they selected Heinz Bermers. He was 47 years old, in poor health, exempted from military service. Before World War I, his family had owned Chateau Smith Haut Lafitte. The French government had confiscated it as enemy property in 1914, but Bermers had maintained contacts in the region. He'd imported French wine for decades. He knew the producers. He knew the chateau. He spoke the language. His arrival in Bordeaux created a cruel dilemma. Many winemakers had done business with Bermers for years. They considered him a friend. Now he represented the enemy. He wore the uniform. He carried the authority to requisition their entire production. Bermers called a meeting. He assured the winemakers he was still their friend. He would protect them from the worst excesses. He would prevent random looting. But he had quotas to meet. Germany demanded wine. They would provide wine. The alternative was seizure without compensation. The system worked like this. German military authorities would issue purchase orders. The amounts were staggering: 50,000 bottles per week from Moet and Chandon alone. That was 1/10 of all the champagne the Germans were requisitioning, every week, for years. The Weinführers would negotiate prices, always below market value, always paid in French francs that were worthless outside occupied territory. The wine would be loaded onto trains, shipped to Germany, sold internationally for 10 times what Germany had paid. France wasn't just losing its wine, it was subsidizing the destruction of Europe. Winemakers faced impossible choices: cooperate and watch your life's work enrich the enemy, refuse and face confiscation, imprisonment, or worse. Most cooperated. They had families, employees, vineyards that needed tending, bills that needed paying. Cooperation was survival, but cooperation had limits. In Burgundy, Maurice Drouhin ran a respected negociant house. The family had been in wine since 1880. Maurice himself was a decorated World War I veteran. He'd fought in the trenches, survived mustard gas, seen what Germans could do to France. When German soldiers arrived in Boone in June 1940, Maurice made preparations. His family had cellars stretching nearly a hectare beneath the city. Ancient vaulted passages dating to the 13th century, perfect for hiding wine. Maurice gathered his children. He gave them a task: find spiders, as many as possible. Collect them in jars. Don't ask why. The children scoured the cellars, gathered dozens of spiders, brought them to their father. Maurice and his workers built a false wall at the end of one passage. Behind it, they stacked the family's most valuable bottles, premier crus from legendary vintages, wines worth more than the chateau itself. Then they released the spiders onto the new wall. The spiders did what spiders do. They spun webs. Within days, the wall looked ancient. Cobwebs hung thick. Dust accumulated. A German officer inspecting the cellar would see an old wall covered in spiders and keep walking. The technique worked. The false wall survived the entire occupation. Other winemakers developed their own methods. In Paris, carpet cleaning establishments saved dust from old rugs. Restaurants would buy the dust and sprinkle it on cheap young bottles. German soldiers, paying inflated prices, thought they were buying rare vintages. They were getting Planck dressed up with carpet dust and a convincing story. Labels were switched. Inferior wines were placed in bottles from famous chateaus. The good wine was hidden. The bad wine was sold. Germans rarely knew the difference. At Moet and Chandon, the situation was more complex. The chateau on the grounds of Dom Perignon's abbey had been burned. German troops occupied the remaining buildings. The company was ordered to supply 50,000 bottles of champagne per week. There was no way to avoid compliance. Robert Jean de Vogüé ran Moet and Chandon. He was well respected among champagne producers. As the occupation dragged on, de Vogüé became the single negotiator for the entire champagne industry. He formed a trade organization to collectively bargain with the Germans. It gave the appearance of cooperation while creating opportunities for resistance. The weinführer for Champagne was Otto Klebisch. He knew wine. He knew the producers. He also knew that wine required cooperation. You couldn't force quality. You couldn't torture vines into producing better grapes. If you pushed too hard, production collapsed. This created a strange relationship. The weinführers needed the French to keep producing. The French needed the weinführers to prevent total confiscation. Neither side trusted the other. Both sides lied constantly. But the wine kept flowing. Hermann Goering, meanwhile, wasn't satisfied with the official requisitions. The Reichsmarshal wanted the best bottles for himself. Goering was the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, commander of the Luftwaffe, Hitler's designated successor, a World War I flying ace who'd been awarded the Pour le Mérite. He was also a morphine addict, a compulsive looter, and a man of extravagant tastes. Goering collected everything: art, jewelry, castles, hunting lodges. His estate at Karrenhall north of Berlin was filled with stolen masterpieces. Trains arrived regularly with plundered goods from across Europe. 26,000 railroad cars full of art treasures from France alone. Wine was just another category of loot. Goring's favorite was Chateau Lafite Rothschild. The Bordeaux estate dated to the 17th century. It had been rated first growth in the 1855 classification. A bottle from a good year could cost more than most workers earned in a month. Goring's Berlin cellar contained over 3,000 bottles. Many were Lafite. Despite being a Jewish-owned estate, Chateau Lafite survived relatively intact during the occupation. The Vichy government seized control in 1942, but they focused on producing wine, not destroying the vineyards. Goering had his eye on the estate. He wanted to acquire it outright. Fortunately for the Rothschilds, he never succeeded. Other estates weren't so lucky. At Chateau Mouton Rothschild, also Jewish-owned, German troops took over the buildings. Baron Philippe de Rothschild fled to England before he could be arrested. His daughter Philippine, just a child, watched German soldiers march through their home. She watched her mother dragged away. Her mother would die in Ravensbrück concentration camp. Despite the Jewish ownership, Goering loved Mouton wines. He ordered cases shipped to Karrenhall. The Weinführer Heinz Bermers, who despised Goering, had a response. He instructed the winemakers to send the worst wines they had, fill the bottles labeled Mouton Rothschild with inferior wine, ordinary table wine, vin ordinaire. Goering apparently never noticed. As the war dragged on, the looting intensified, food became scarce, rationing was imposed, maintaining vineyards became difficult, fertilizer was unavailable, treatments for pests and rot were scarce, labor was conscripted. The wine industry should have collapsed. But the winemakers kept their vineyards alive because wine wasn't just commerce, it was French identity, it was heritage, it was the land itself made liquid. Letting the vineyards die meant letting France die. Some winemakers went further than hiding bottles. They joined the resistance. Maurice Drouhin became a liaison officer. He passed information to the Allies, reported German troop movements, helped coordinate drops for resistance fighters. The work was extraordinarily dangerous. The Gestapo had informers everywhere. Captured resistance members were tortured, then executed. Winemakers had advantages. Their cellars were perfect for hiding people and weapons. Their trucks could transport contraband under the guise of wine deliveries. Their business relationships provided cover for meetings, and if caught, they could claim they were just trying to protect their product. The Gestapo wasn't fooled for long. On June 7, 1944, the day after D-Day, the Gestapo came for Maurice Drouhin. An execution squad arrived at his home before dawn. Maurice received warning minutes before they kicked in the door. He fled through his bedroom into the family cellars, the 1-hectare maze of passages he knew better than anyone alive. Maurice ran through the darkness, found the passage he needed, reached a door hidden behind wine racks, the door of freedom as it would later be known. The door led to the Hospices de Bonn, a charity hospital run by Catholic nuns since 1443. Maurice had served as vice president of the hospices since 1941. The nuns knew him, trusted him. When he emerged from the hidden passage, they took him in without question. The Gestapo searched the Drouhin cellars for hours, found nothing. Maurice Drouhin spent the next 6 months hiding in the hospices, living in the tunnels beneath the hospital, emerging only when absolutely necessary. The nuns brought him food, kept his secret, saved his life. In gratitude, Maurice later donated 7 acres of prime vineyard to the hospices. The profits from those vineyards still fund the hospital today. Every year at the Hospices de Bonn wine auction, the Drouhin family buys back the barrel made from Maurice's donated parcels. A reminder that wine, resistance, and survival had become inseparable. By spring 1945, Germany was collapsing. Allied armies were crushing in from all sides. The Soviets were blocks from Berlin. The Americans and British were sweeping through southern Germany. Hitler was about to commit suicide in his bunker, and 3 separate Allied units were racing toward Berchtesgaden, racing toward Hitler's mountain retreat, racing toward the greatest concentration of looted treasure in Europe, including wine cellars that would make Lewis Nixon forget just for a moment that he'd survived a war. May 4, 1945, 3 armies converged on a single target. Berchtesgaden, the Bavarian mountain town that had become synonymous with Nazi power, nestled in the Alps on the Austrian border. Population less than 5,000. Strategic value, minimal. Symbolic value, incalculable. This was where Hitler had planned the conquest of Europe, where he'd hosted Chamberlain and negotiated the Munich Agreement, where top Nazi leadership had built elaborate retreats, where the myth of the 1,000-year Reich had been crafted in mountain air and alpine views. The town itself was built on a plateau. Above it, carved into the mountain called Obersalzberg, sat Hitler's personal residence, the Berghof, a sprawling chalet with panoramic windows overlooking the valley. Rising 3,000 feet above the Berghof was the Kelstein House, the Eagle's Nest, a tea house perched on a rocky peak, accessible only by a road with 5 tunnels and a gold-plated elevator that ran through the center of the mountain. Allied intelligence believed the Germans might make a final stand here, create a national redoubt, gather the remnants of the Wehrmacht and SS, fight to the last man in the mountains. It was probably nonsense. German forces were exhausted, demoralized, running out of ammunition, but the threat was enough to make Berchtesgaden a priority. General Dwight Eisenhower ordered 2 units to take the town. The French 2nd Armored Division, commanded by General Philippe Leclerc, and the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, fresh from Bastogne. There was one problem. The U.S. 3rd Infantry Division was already nearby, fighting in Salzburg, Austria, just across the border. The 3rd Division had suffered more casualties than any other American division in the European theater. They'd fought across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, southern France, and into Germany. They called themselves the Rock of the Marne. Major General John O'Daniel commanded the 3rd Division. He'd been lobbying for permission to take Berchtesgaden for days. His staff had mapped the routes. His men were in position. The town was right there. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, had said no. The honor would go to the 101st and the French. O'Daniel decided to ignore orders. On the morning of May 4, he ordered the 7th Infantry Regiment to move. 2 battalions. They crossed the Salich River using the only 2 remaining bridges, a damaged railroad bridge and a small wooden span, both in 3rd Division hands. Anyone else wanting to reach Berchtesgaden would need to cross those bridges. O'Daniel positioned troops to block the bridges. Then he sent word to Shaif, "We're taking Berchtesgaden. Your authorized units are welcome to join us after we secure it. The 7th Infantry reached Berchtesgaden at 1600 hours on May 4. No resistance. The town was empty. German forces had fled days earlier. A few SS troops had burned documents and smashed equipment, but the destruction was minimal. A platoon advanced up the mountain to Obersalzberg. When they arrived at the Berghof, they found devastation. The Royal Air Force had bombed the complex on April 25. Parts of the Berghof were reduced to rubble. The SS barracks were destroyed. Buildings still smoldered, but the kitchens and pantries had survived. Stocked floor to ceiling, the soldiers found enormous quantities of wine, liquor, cheese, and canned food. They opened bottles immediately, drank in the ruins, toasted the destruction of the Third Reich with wine the Führer had never drunk. The French 2nd Armored Division arrived later that afternoon. They'd been racing toward Berchtesgaden all day. When they reached the Seilash bridges, American soldiers blocked them. The 3rd Division had gotten there first. The French were furious. General Leclerc himself was livid. This was supposed to be their victory. France had suffered under occupation for 5 years. They'd earned the right to seize Hitler's retreat. Instead, the Americans had ignored orders and taken it out from under them. But the complex was vast. There were buildings everywhere. Surely there were other prizes to be claimed. Early on May 5th, French troops made the treacherous climb to the Eagle's Nest. The road was steep, 5 tunnels, sharp turns. The elevator was disabled. They'd have to climb the final section on foot. When they reached the summit, they found the Eagle's Nest completely intact. No bomb damage. The interior was untouched. Gold leaf still decorated the elevator shaft. The panoramic windows still framed views of the Alps. And in the cellars beneath the tea house, they found something extraordinary. Wine, 500,000 bottles, maybe more. The French soldiers stood in the cellar, trying to comprehend what they were seeing. This wasn't a wine collection. This was a museum of French viticulture. Every major chateau was represented. Every legendary vintage. Bordeaux from the 1920s. Burgundy from before World War I. Champagne from houses that defined the category. Cognac that predated Napoleon. This was France's heritage. Stolen systematically, shipped north. Assembled in this mountain fortress for the personal enjoyment of men who destroyed millions of lives. Captain Laurent Touillas, Georges Biot, and Paul Répiton-Preneuf documented the find with photographs. They selected bottles immediately. The problem was transport. They were at the top of a mountain. The elevator didn't work. They couldn't carry 500,000 bottles down by hand. Someone had a brilliant idea: medical stretchers. The French brought up medics with stretchers. They loaded bottles onto the stretchers. 2 men would carry each stretcher down the mountain. Slowly, carefully, hundreds of trips. At the bottom, they loaded the bottles into trucks and tanks. To make room, French soldiers dumped equipment, ammunition, spare parts, tools, clothing, anything that wasn't essential. They emptied canteens and filled them with wine. Chateau Latour, 1929. Mouton Rothschild, 1934. Lafite, 1937. Wines worth $1,000 a bottle, sloshing around in military canteens. The 101st Airborne arrived on the morning of May 5th. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 2nd Battalion, Easy Company. The soldiers who jumped into Normandy, held Bastogne, survived a winter in hell. They'd been promised Berchtesgaden as a reward. Instead, they found the 3rd Division already there, and the French loading wine into trucks. Colonel Robert Sink, commanding the 506th, met with his counterpart from the 7th Infantry. The orders were clear. The 3rd Division would withdraw. The 101st would take over occupation duties. Sheaf wanted the mix-up resolved quietly. The 3rd Division didn't leave empty-handed. Before withdrawing, they discovered Hermann Goering's personal residence in the valley below the Berghof. The cellar contained 16,000 bottles. They loaded 6 trucks with wine, headed back to Salzburg, left 10,000 bottles for whoever came next. Major Dick Winters of the 506th found Goering's cellar hours later. 10,000 bottles remained, maybe more. The count didn't really matter at that point. What mattered was the quality. Hermann Goering had assembled the finest wine collection in Nazi Germany. while Berliners starved, while his Luftwaffe was being obliterated, while Germany bled from 1,000,000 wounds. Goering had been selecting Bordeaux and arranging for shipments to his various residences. His favorite was Chateau Lafite Rothschild. Case after case, vintage after vintage. The 1920s had been exceptional years for Bordeaux. The 1929 especially. Goering had bought heavily. Now his collection sat in a Bavarian cellar, waiting for Americans who'd never heard of Lafite to discover what a Grand Cru tasted like. Winters organized the distribution, 1 truckload per company. Officers got first choice. Captain Lewis Nixon, the battalion's operations officer, had first pick of everything. Nixon knew wine. His family was wealthy. He'd grown up understanding the difference between good wine and great wine. He'd also developed a serious drinking problem. His preferred poison was VAT 69 whiskey, but he appreciated fine wine when he saw it. Standing in Goering's cellar, Nixon selected 5 truckloads for the officers. The best bottles, the oldest vintages, wines that would have made collectors weep. May 7, Germany signed the surrender agreement. The war in Europe was officially over. The 506th celebrated the only way that made sense. They distributed Goering's wine, 1 truckload per company, thousands of bottles. The party that followed became legendary. Drunk paratroopers zipped around Berchtesgaden in Mercedes limousines they'd found in Nazi garages. They fired weapons into the air. They drank bottles that cost more than they'd earned in a year. Some got violently sick from mixing champagne with cognac with Bordeaux. Others just passed out in the streets. The photograph taken the morning of May 8 shows Captain Lewis Nixon surrounded by bottles, empty bottles, dozens of them. He's sitting on a bed, looking exhausted. The bottles tell the story. Chateau this, Domaine that, labels in French, corks scattered on the floor. The morning after the greatest party most of these men would ever attend. Throughout May, thousands of Allied soldiers visited Berchtesgaden, tourists in uniform. They wandered through Hitler's ruins, took souvenirs. Everything that could be carried was carried away. Silverware with Hitler's initials, paintings, books, anything that proved they'd been there. The wine, however, was mostly gone by then. The 3rd Division had taken 6 truckloads. The French had taken hundreds of cases. The 10th had drunk or distributed most of Goering's personal cellar. What remained was inferior stock or bottles too heavy to carry. The French were particularly focused on recovering their heritage. This wasn't looting, this was reclaiming stolen property. Every bottle they carried down from the Eagle's Nest was a bottle that France had lost 5 years earlier. Getting it back, even if they drank it immediately, felt like justice. Bernard de Nonancourt, a lieutenant in the French 2nd Armored Division, entered the Eagle's Nest cellar and found cases of Champagne Ceylon. The bottles had been stolen from his family's company 5 years earlier. He recognized the cases, knew exactly when they'd been taken. He loaded them personally, sent them home to France. The irony was thick. Nazi leadership had spent 5 years systematically looting France, requisitioning wine by the trainload, selling it for profit, building personal collections. And now, in the final days of the war, Allied soldiers were doing the same thing, taking wine without asking, drinking it without payment. The difference was these bottles had been stolen property to begin with. Returning them to France or drinking them seemed like appropriate revenge, but the story was more complicated than simple revenge. Hermann Goering never saw his Berchtesgaden cellar looted. On April 25, 1945, Goering had a falling out with Hitler, a serious one. Goering had sent a telegram asking if he should assume leadership of Germany since Hitler was trapped in Berlin. Hitler interpreted this as betrayal. He ordered Goering arrested. Goering fled Berlin, headed south to Austria. He surrendered to American troops near Salzburg on May 7, close to Berchtesgaden, close to his wine. He'd never see either again. Goering's Berlin cellar fell to the Soviets. Over 3,000 bottles. Russian soldiers drank some immediately. The rest was sent to Moscow. Eventually, some bottles ended up at the Krakova cellar in Moldova. Today, 129 bottles from Goering's collection remain there, each worth between $10,000 and $15,000, stolen by Goering, seized by Soviets, preserved as historical artifacts. The French winemakers, who'd hidden bottles and resisted the occupation, never got their specific bottles back. The bottles in Berchtesgaden were redistributed, drunk, lost to history, but France recovered something more important. The vineyards survived, production resumed. The 1945 harvest, despite terrible weather and shortages of everything, produced some of the finest wines France had ever made. Maurice Drouhin emerged from hiding when American troops liberated Beaune. His false wall had protected the family's best bottles through 5 years of occupation. His donation to the hospices de Beaune ensured his story would be remembered. Heinz Bonomers, the weinführer who'd sabotaged Goering's orders and protected French winemakers from the worst excesses, faced an uncertain future. He'd worn the uniform, he'd served the Reich, but Baron Philippe de Rothschild, whose family had suffered horribly under occupation, agreed to let Bonomers represent Chateau Mouton Rothschild in Germany after the war. The man who'd filled Goering's orders with inferior wine earned a second chance. But not everyone who'd stolen French wine escaped justice. The cost of Nazi plunder went far beyond wine. The bottles tell only part of the story. The rest is written in lives. Over 5 years of occupation, Germany shipped over 200 million bottles of French wine north. 200 million. The number defies comprehension. That's not counting wine drunk by German soldiers in France, not counting wine used to pay collaborators, not counting bottles destroyed or lost. The economic cost to France was catastrophic. Wine represented nearly 20% of the French economy. The industry employed millions directly or indirectly. Vineyards, winemaking, bottling, shipping, marketing, restaurants, export. The entire structure depended on wine flowing normally. Under occupation, wine became tribute. Germany paid below market prices in worthless currency. The profits went to funding the Wehrmacht. The wine that should have rebuilt France after 1940 instead funded the destruction of Europe. But the economic cost was nothing compared to the human cost. When Philippine de Rothschild's mother was dragged from their home and put on a train to Ravensbrück, she joined millions of others targeted by Nazi racial laws. Elizabeth de Rothschild died in the concentration camp. She never saw the end of the war, never knew that her daughter survived, never learned that Chateau Mouton Rothschild would be restored. Hundreds of French winemakers joined the resistance. They used their cellars to hide weapons and people, used their trucks to transport fighters, used their business relationships to pass intelligence. The Gestapo caught many of them. Maurice Drouhin was lucky. He escaped, hid for 6 months, survived. Others weren't so fortunate. At champagne houses across the region, winemakers who sabotaged German orders or helped resistance fighters were arrested. Some were shot immediately, others were sent to camps. The lucky ones came home. Many didn't. The 1945 vintage, celebrated as one of the greatest France ever produced, was made by women. The men were dead, imprisoned, or still fighting. Vineyard owners' wives and daughters ran operations they'd never expected to manage. They made decisions about harvest timing and fermentation with minimal resources and no guarantee they'd survive long enough to see the wine in bottles. The vintage was tiny, terrible weather, late frost, limited fertilizer, but the grapes that did mature were exceptional. Perfect sugar levels, ideal acidity. The 1945 wines became legendary. Baron Philippe de Rothschild commissioned an artist to create a special label for Chateau Mouton Rothschild. It showed a large V for victory, the year of liberation, the year France began to heal. Hermann Goering never tasted the 1945 vintage. He was in custody by then, on trial at Nuremberg, the most senior Nazi defendant, now that Hitler, Goebbels, and Himmler had killed themselves. The trial lasted from November 1945 to October 1946. Goering defended himself vigorously. He was articulate, intelligent, unrepentant. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Crimes against humanity, war crimes, planning aggressive war, looting on an industrial scale. His art collection alone was worth $200 million, 1,500 pieces, all stolen. The wine collection was just a footnote in a much larger pattern of theft. On October 1, 1946, Goering was sentenced to death by hanging. He was scheduled to be executed on October 16th. He cheated the gallows by swallowing a cyanide capsule the night before, one final act of defiance. His wine collections were dispersed. Some bottles went to museums, some were sold at auction, some simply disappeared into private collections. The bottles that Allied soldiers had drunk in Berchtesgaden were probably the lucky ones. At least they'd been consumed, enjoyed, used for their intended purpose, even if the people drinking them weren't the intended recipients. The French winemaking families rebuilt. Slowly, the Drunkens expanded their operation. Robert Drouhin took over from Maurice in 1957 and built the company into one of Burgundy's most respected houses. The family eventually expanded to Oregon, creating Domaine Drouhin in the late 1980s. French soul, Oregon soil, a connection that never would have happened without the war. The Rothschilds reclaimed their estates. Baron Philippe led the fight to have Chateau Mouton Rothschild elevated from second growth to first growth in 1973, the only change ever made to the 1855 classification. The promotion was vindication, recognition that Mouton belonged among the greatest. The Hugels in Alsace, rebuilt. The de Nononcourts in Champagne, rebuilt. Every family that had lost members, lost vineyards, lost years of production, somehow found the strength to continue. The weinführers faced varying fates. Some were prosecuted for collaboration. Others, like Heinz Böhmers, were given second chances. The French recognized that not all Germans who'd worn the uniform had been equally culpable. Böhmers had protected winemakers when he could have destroyed them. That counted for something. The 101st Airborne stayed in Berchtesgaden through the summer of 1945. They turned the area into a rest and recreation zone for Allied troops. Thousands of soldiers visited. The Eagle's Nest became a tourist destination. What remained of the wine was distributed or drunk. By August, the cellars were empty. Lewis Nixon returned to the United States in September 19. He never fired a shot during the war, despite jumping into Normandy, fighting in Holland, and surviving Bastogne. He'd been intelligence officer, then operations officer, a planner, a logistics expert, someone who made things work. He never forgot Goering's wine cellar. In later interviews, he'd talk about it with a mixture of awe and disgust. The quality was undeniable, but every bottle represented theft. Every case proved that Nazi leadership had lived extravagantly while their country starved. Nixon struggled with alcoholism for years after the war. The wine in Berchtesgaden hadn't helped. He eventually got sober, took over his family business, but the war stayed with him. All those men who'd survived Normandy and Bastogne, only to get drunk in a Nazi mountain retreat on stolen French wine. It was absurd. It was fitting. It was war. The Eagle's Nest was returned to Bavaria in 1960. Today it operates as a restaurant and tourist site, open seasonally, accessible by the same road and elevator that Hitler had used. Visitors can eat lunch at the summit, look out at the same views that Nazi leadership had enjoyed. The wine cellars are long empty, but the building remains as a monument to both Nazi ambition and Allied victory. Berchtesgaden itself has become a popular alpine resort. Few visitors think about the wine. They come for the scenery, the history, the connection to events that shaped the 20th century. But every restaurant and hotel in town serves wine. French wine, German wine, Italian wine, bottles that traveled freely across borders, sold legally, drunk without guilt. The wine that Hermann Goering never drank financed the hospices de Beaune for decades. Maurice Drouhin's donated vineyards produce wine annually. The proceeds fund medical care. The auction is one of the most prestigious in France. Every November, buyers from around the world bid on barrels of Burgundy. The profits help people who have nothing to do with war or occupation or resistance. Wine, it turns out, is patient. Vineyards survive wars, bottles outlast empires, and the best revenge is making something beautiful from something that was meant to be destroyed. 500,000 bottles in the Eagle's Nest, 16,000 in Goering's personal cellar, millions more scattered across German-occupied Europe, every one stolen, every one representing a piece of French heritage turned into Nazi plunder. Allied soldiers found them all, drank some, sent some home, returned some to France. The bottles themselves are mostly gone now, consumed, lost to history. What remains are the stories. Maurice Drouhin building false walls and enlisting spiders, French soldiers dumping ammunition to make room for champagne, Lewis Nixon standing in a cellar trying to count bottles that added up to more wealth than he'd ever imagined, American paratroopers celebrating victory in Europe with wine meant for the Führer who just shot himself in Berlin. The wine was always about more than wine. It was about French identity, about resistance, about refusing to let the enemy take everything. The winemakers who risked their lives to hide bottles weren't protecting commerce, they were protecting culture, history, the land itself. And when Allied soldiers found those bottles in Berchtesgaden, they weren't just seizing loot, they were reclaiming something that never should have been taken. Some of them knew it, most didn't, but every bottle drunk in celebration that May was a bottle that would never toast Nazi victory. The vineyards survived, France survived, and today, the greatest wines in the world still come from the regions that refused to die under occupation. That's the real victory, not the bottles recovered, but the heritage that endured. If you found this story of theft, resistance, and unlikely justice compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to WWII Tales to stay connected with history that matters. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you'd have drunk the wine or sent it home. Thank you for watching and for remembering.